The sound that defined my childhood wasn't laughter or conversation. It was the relentless, cascading notes of a grand piano. Our house in the wealthy suburbs of Boston wasn't a home, it was a concert hall, and my brother, Leo, was the star performer. I was the ghost who haunted its corridors, the silent audience to a show I never bought a ticket for. It began the moment I woke up, the sound seeping through the floorboards, Czerny's exercises, precise and mechanical, a metronome ticking away the seconds of my irrelevance. It continued through the afternoon with the passionate, thunderous chords of Rachmaninoff, and ended late at night with the melancholic whisper of a Chopin nocturne. That piano, a glossy black Steinway that my parents had taken out a second mortgage to afford, was the altar upon which my family sacrificed everything, especially me. My name is Amelia, and on the eve of my 17th birthday, my world wasn't shattered. It was methodically, deliberately drowned. The evening began like any other. Leo was practicing Liszt's La Campanella, his fingers flying across the keys with an almost arrogant grace. He was 18, golden-haired and gifted, the sun around which our small family solar system orbited. My father, Edward, sat in his worn leather armchair, eyes closed, a look of vicarious ecstasy on his face. He had been a moderately talented violinist in his youth, a dream he'd abandoned for a stable but soul-crushing career in finance. He saw Leo not as a son, but as a second chance, a vessel for his own squandered ambitions. My mother, Claire, stood leaning against the doorframe, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Her adoration for Leo was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket of devotion that left no warmth for anyone else. And then, there was me. I was in my room, a small, cramped space at the back of the house that overlooked the neighbor's dreary fence. The music from downstairs was inescapable, a constant, oppressive weight. To counter it, I had my own sanctuary, a second-hand Wacom tablet with a spider web of cracks across the screen. There, in the silent world of pixels and pressure strokes, I could finally breathe. My art was my rebellion. It was everything our house was not. Vibrant, chaotic, and screaming with emotion. That night, I was working on a piece I called Gilded Cage. It depicted a boy with piano keys for ribs, his heart a trapped songbird, while a girl made of shadows stood outside, her hands pressed against the bars, leaving smudges of brilliant color wherever she touched. It was my life, rendered in RGB. The summons for dinner came, as always, as a brief pause in the music. At the table, the conversation orbited Leo, as it always did. My father recounted, for the 100th time, how Leo's instructor at the conservatory had called his talent a once-in-a-generation phenomenon. My mother detailed the bland, gluten-free diet she was enforcing to ensure his peak physical and mental acuity for his upcoming competitions. I pushed mashed potatoes around my plate. An invisible spectator, then came the announcement. My father cleared his throat, a theatrical gesture that meant momentous news was coming. He beamed at Leo, telling him that his application had been accepted. He was to spend the entire summer in Vienna, attending the prestigious International Music Academy, a program that cost more than a down payment on a small car, $15,000. My mother added that it was an investment, a crucial stepping stone for his inevitable debut at Carnegie Hall. Leo accepted the news with the practiced humility of someone who has never been denied anything in his life. He said he was honored and would work hard to make them proud. A reckless, desperate courage surged through me. It was a now-or-never moment. I had been saving for months, working a grueling after-school job at a local library. Hoarding every dollar, I spoke up, my voice feeling rusty from disuse. I told them that I had been looking at a pre-college summer program, a 2-week intensive course on digital animation at the Rhode Island School of Design. I explained how it was one of the best programs in the country, how it could lead to real career opportunities. I laid out the costs, the logistics, my voice gaining a sliver of confidence as I spoke. The total cost was $800, a pittance compared to Vienna. I told them I had already saved half and was just asking for their help with the rest. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, but a cold, heavy vacuum. Leo looked down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by his green beans. My mother's smile tightened at the corners. My father put down his fork and looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth they held for my brother. He used his calm, rational voice, the one that was far more devastating than any shout. He told me that my drawing was a lovely hobby, a charming pastime, but that was all it would ever be. He spoke of the world in terms of practicality and legacy. He said that Leo's music was a legacy, an art form with history and prestige. My computer drawings, as he called them, were a fleeting trend, a dead-end street for starving artists. He concluded his speech by telling me that my responsibility was to focus on my real studies, to get a sensible degree that would lead to a stable job. A job, he added with a pointed look, that would allow me to contribute to the family and support the immense cost of fostering true genius. He wasn't just saying no, he was defining my role in life, to be a financial support system for my brother's dreams. My mother said nothing, only reaching across the table to pat my hand, a gesture of pity so condescending it felt like a slap. I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that my words were meaningless against the fortress of their conviction. I simply excused myself from the table, the uneaten food on my plate a symbol of the nourishment I never received in that house. The following weeks were a blur of quiet defiance. The incident at the dinner table had hardened something inside me. It was no longer about a summer course. It was about escape. I secretly redoubled my efforts. I spent every waking moment outside of school and my job working on a portfolio. This wasn't just for a summer program anymore. This was for a full 4-year scholarship to RISD. It was my moonshot, my one-way ticket out of this gilded cage. I called it my Exodus portfolio, a collection of my most powerful personal work. It contained everything: the pain, the loneliness, the flicker of defiant hope. Gilded Cage was the centerpiece. Another was a self-portrait titled Echo in the Attic, where my form was semi-transparent, fading into the dusty background of our home. A ghost in my own life. I even won an award for it. The Regional Scholastic Art Award, a prestigious honor. My art teacher had urged me to enter, and I had won the gold key, the highest prize. I remember walking home with the heavy, framed certificate, a rare, fragile bubble of pride in my chest. Maybe this, I thought, would be enough. Tangible proof. I found my parents in the living room, listening to a new recording Leo had made. I waited for a pause in the music and presented the award. I explained what it was, my voice trembling slightly. My father took the frame from my hands, glanced at it for a moment, and said that it was nice, dear. My mother smiled vaguely and told me that was wonderful. Then, without missing a beat, my father turned to my mother and asked if she had remembered to call the piano tuner for Monday. The award, my proof of worth, was placed on the mantelpiece. The next day, I found it moved to a side table in the hallway to make room for a new, smaller trophy Leo had won at a local competition. It was a clear, unspoken message. Even my greatest achievement was nothing more than clutter in the shrine dedicated to my brother. That was the moment the last vestiges of hope for their approval died. My Exodus portfolio was now my only god, my only religion. I poured every ounce of my soul into it, refining every line, tweaking every color. I scanned documents, wrote essays in the dead of night, and compiled everything onto a single, precious external hard drive, a small black rectangle that held my entire future. The deadline for the scholarship application was Friday at midnight. On Thursday evening, I was in my room doing the final review, my heart hammering with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope. I never heard him come in. The sound of the piano downstairs had masked his footsteps. Suddenly, my father was just there, standing in my doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes weren't on me but on my laptop screen, where the RISD application portal was open. He asked me what I thought I was doing. His voice was dangerously quiet. I tried to explain, to stammer something about scholarships and my future, but he cut me off. He told me he knew what was best for me, that he wouldn't stand by and watch me throw my life away on a childish fantasy. He walked over to my desk. I was frozen, a primal fear seizing my muscles. He talked as he moved, his words a torrent of calculated cruelty. He spoke of his duty as a father to protect me from my own foolishness, to steer me away from a life of destitution and regret. He said that I was being selfish, trying to destabilize the family's focus when Leo was at such a critical juncture in his career. He saw the external hard drive plugged into my laptop. He knew what it was. He held out his hand and told me to give it to him. I refused, instinctively covering it with my own hand. His face hardened. He was not a man accustomed to being defied. He simply unplugged it from the laptop himself. I stood up, pleading with him, the words catching in my throat. He ignored me, his gaze fixed on the hard drive in his hand as if it were a venomous insect. On my desk was a glass of water I'd brought up earlier. What happened next felt like it was in slow motion, a nightmare unfolding in horrifying clarity. He looked from the hard drive to the glass of water, and then back to me, his eyes daring me to stop him. He told me that one day, I would thank him for this, and then he dropped it. The small black rectangle hit the water with a quiet plunk. There was no dramatic splash, just a small ripple. It sank to the bottom of the glass, a tiny red indicator light on its side glowing for a second. A final, desperate heartbeat, before flickering out into darkness. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air was gone from my lungs. The world narrowed to that glass of water, to the drowned vessel of my future sitting at the bottom. It was my entire life's work, years of dreams and secret hopes, extinguished in an instant. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. Even the piano downstairs had finally stopped playing. My father placed the glass back on my desk with a steady hand. He looked at me, his expression not of anger anymore, but of grim satisfaction, as if he had just performed a difficult but necessary surgery. He told me that now, I could focus on what truly mattered. Then he turned and walked out of my room, closing the door softly behind him. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe. I was no longer a person, I was a vacuum, a hollowed-out thing. Later, I don't know how much later, I heard their voices from the hallway, muffled through the door. It was my mother. Her voice was a nervous whisper, asking Edward if he thought he had gone too far, and then I heard my father's reply, each word a final, perfectly sharpened blade twisting in my soul. He told her he was protecting me, that he was protecting all of us. He said I needed to understand my place. And then, the words that would become the anthem of my revenge, the fuel for the fire that was about to ignite from my ashes. In this family, Claire, he said, his voice laced with unshakable certainty, there is only one star. We all have to sacrifice for Leo. Sacrifice. That was the word he used. I wasn't his daughter. I was a sacrifice. An offering to be laid at the altar of my brother's talent. Something inside me snapped. The profound, bottomless grief that had filled me began to recede, replaced by something new. It was a cold, pure, and terrifying clarity. The tears that had been frozen in my eyes never fell. I walked to the window and looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The pale, frightened girl staring back was a stranger. I didn't know her anymore, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, who I was about to become. The ghost was done haunting. It was time to burn the whole damn house down. For a long time after he closed the door, I didn't move. The silence in the house was a physical presence. A thick, suffocating blanket where the piano music used to be. The only sound was a faint, high-pitched ringing in my ears. I stared at the glass on my desk, at the small black coffin of my future submerged in the water. The grief I should have felt was absent. In its place, a strange and terrifying calm settled over me, as cold and clear as the water in that glass. The fire of fury had burned through the fog of my despair, leaving behind a landscape of sharp, crystalline purpose. He had told me I was a sacrifice. He was wrong. A sacrifice is given. I was being taken, and I would not go quietly. My movements became deliberate, stripped of all wasted motion. There was no crying, no frantic panic, just the quiet, efficient dismantling of my life in that house. I slid my cracked Wacom tablet into my backpack, along with its stylus and charging cord. It was worthless to anyone but me. I grabbed the only sketchbook I had, its pages filled with the ghosts of the digital art I had lost. Then, I opened my closet. My hands bypassed the few nice outfits my mother had insisted I buy for family functions, clothes for the role of the quiet, supportive daughter, and went straight for the practical. Black jeans, durable hoodies, layers I could wear for days. As my fingers brushed against a worn denim jacket, my mind snagged on a memory, sharp and sudden as a fishhook. I was 10 years old. For my birthday, my parents had given me a bicycle. It was a clunky, second-hand Schwinn, painted a dull, practical blue. It had been purchased from a garage sale, and my father had spent a morning lecturing me on the value of thrift and the character-building nature of used things. I remembered him telling me that a sensible girl needed a sensible bike. A month later, for Leo's 11th birthday, they unveiled his gift, a brand new gleaming silver Trek racing bike with 21 gears and a lightweight carbon frame. It was a magnificent machine, built for speed and victory. When I had quietly asked why his was new and mine was not, my mother had knelt down, her smile strained, and explained that Leo's potential required the best equipment. His talent, she said, was a delicate instrument, and they couldn't risk it being hampered by faulty gear. The implication was clear. My potential, my joy, was not. It was a sturdy, second-hand thing, capable of withstanding neglect. Packing my worn clothes now, I realized my entire existence in this house had been that blue, second-hand bicycle, functional, reliable, and utterly devoid of splendor. I zipped the backpack shut. It wasn't enough. Clothes and a broken tablet wouldn't get me far. I needed money. The $400 I had saved for the RISD program were hidden in a shoebox under my bed. I retrieved it, the wad of 20s feeling pathetic and flimsy in my hand. It was a start, but it was survival money, not escape velocity. For that, I needed to go deeper into the heart of the enemy territory. My father's study. The house was a tomb at 2 a.m. Every creak of the floorboards was a gunshot in the silence. I moved barefoot, my senses on high alert. The study door was, as always, unlocked. My father's arrogance was his weakness. He never imagined a threat could come from within his own walls. The room smelled of old paper. It was a shrine to his own perceived intellect and, by extension, to Leo's talent. One wall was a bookshelf filled with financial ledgers and biographies of great composers. The other was what I privately called the Wall of Leo. It was covered in framed certificates, photos of him at recitals looking angelic in a tiny tuxedo, and newspaper clippings from local papers praising his prodigious talent. There was not a single picture of me in the entire room. My father kept an emergency cash stash somewhere in here. I'd overheard him telling my mother about it once during a discussion about power outages. I started my search methodically, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs. I checked the desk drawers, the bookshelf, the space behind the Bach biography. Nothing. My frustration grew, mingling with the ever-present rage. I was about to give up when my eyes fell upon a heavy, ornate wooden box on the bottom shelf, tucked behind a set of encyclopedias. It was his legacy box. I'd seen him place things in it over the years, always with a sense of reverence. It was where he kept Leo's first recital program, a lock of his hair from his first haircut, the program from his debut with the local youth symphony. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. The top layer was just as I expected, a yellowed collection of Leo's triumphs. But underneath them, there was a large manila envelope. My name wasn't on it, but my intuition screamed. I slid the contents out. It wasn't cash. It was far, far worse. It was a collection of financial documents, projections, plans, legal papers. My father, the meticulous financial planner, had charted out the next 20 years of our lives. The first document was a life insurance policy taken out on my life, with my father as the sole beneficiary. A note clipped to it, in his precise, cramped handwriting, detailed how the payout would be used to cover the final 2 years of Leo's conservatory tuition at Juilliard, should anything happen to me. I felt the blood drain from my face. I was worth more to him dead than alive. But the next document was the one that truly broke me. It was a financial projection titled Family Contribution Plan, L. Edwards. It was a spreadsheet. It listed my name, an estimated future salary based on a degree in business administration from a state college, and a line item titled Mandatory Familial Tithe. He had calculated, down to the dollar, how 30% of my projected post-tax income would be diverted into an investment fund for Leo. The fund was designed to support my brother's career indefinitely, to pay for his managers, his publicists, his travel, his life. There were notes in the margins about my low-risk, high-yield potential as a stable income source, contrasting with Leo's high-risk, high-reward artistic career. He had turned my life into a prospectus for an investment in my brother. I wasn't a daughter. I was a utility. A walking, breathing annuity for his golden boy. The memory that surfaced now wasn't of an object, but of a feeling. The damp, oppressive heat of my bedroom during the summer. I had pneumonia at age 12. I had been seriously ill, a fever raging for days. Leo had a major regional competition that weekend. My parents were beside themselves with anxiety, but not for me. My mother would bring me soup and check my temperature with a detached, clinical efficiency, but her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. I remember lying in bed, listening to them through the walls, their hushed, frantic voices not about my health, but about whether the stress of the situation would affect Leo's performance. My father had told my mother that they had to shield Leo from it, to keep the house calm for his sake. My illness was an inconvenience, a potential disruption to the great artist's concentration. I recovered, of course, but something inside me had never quite healed. I had learned then that my suffering would always be secondary to his comfort. Seeing this financial plan, I realized it wasn't just my pain that was secondary, it was my entire existence. The rage was back, but it was different now. It was no longer a cold, clear thing. It was a white-hot inferno. I shuffled through the rest of the papers, and there, at the bottom of the envelope, I found it. Tucked into a smaller envelope was a thick stack of $100 bills. $5,000. The emergency cash. This, I thought, is my emergency. I took the money without a second of hesitation. This wasn't theft. It was severance. It was back pay for 17 years of emotional labor. For being the ghost in their machine. I carefully placed the financial documents back in the envelope, but I left it on top of Leo's recital programs. I wanted them to find it. I wanted them to know that I knew. Let the truth be the bomb I left behind. Slipping out of the house was surprisingly easy. They slept the sound sleep of the self-righteous. I walked through the silent living room, my gaze falling on the monstrous black Steinway. It looked like a sarcophagus in the moonlight. For a fleeting moment, I had a wild urge to take the fireplace poker and smash its keys, to shatter its polished surface, to silence it forever. But I didn't. Vandalism was a crime of passion. What I was doing was an act of survival. On the hallway table, next to the discarded trophy and the bowl where we kept our keys, I placed my own house key. I set it down gently, without a sound. It was the last piece of my old life, and I was leaving it behind. The walk to the bus station was 3 miles. The night air was cool and crisp, a welcome shock to my system. With every step I took away from that house, the heavy blanket of its silence lifted, replaced by the symphony of the world. The hum of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the frantic beating of my own liberated heart. At the South Station bus terminal, the fluorescent lights were brutally bright, illuminating a cast of transient souls. The weary, the hopeful, the lost. I felt like all three. I walked to the ticket counter, the $5,000 a heavy, solid rectangle in my jacket pocket. The man behind the glass looked bored. He asked me where I was going. I looked up at the departures board, a flickering list of destinations that all seemed like promises. Boston was my past. I needed a future that was its opposite. Big, loud, anonymous, and so full of life there was no room for ghosts. My voice was steady when I answered him. I told him I needed one ticket, one way, to New York City. The bus ride to New York was a 4-hour descent into a hell of my own making. The initial, cold clarity of my escape began to thaw under the humming engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt, and what seeped in was an agony so profound it felt physical. Trapped in the stale, recycled air, with the dark, fleeting shapes of the Connecticut and New York countryside sliding past the window, there was nowhere left to run from my own mind. Every mile that separated me from Boston was another layer of insulation stripped away, exposing the raw, festering wound of my existence. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching my ghostly reflection superimposed over the dark trees. And the memories, unbidden and cruel, began to surface. Not the grand betrayals, but the small, quiet cuts that had bled me dry over 17 years. I remembered being 8 and creating a detailed, hand-drawn comic book for my father's birthday. I had spent weeks on it, crafting a story where he was a superhero. I presented it to him, my heart thrumming with hope. He had smiled, ruffled my hair, and told me it was very creative, before setting it aside to listen to a new recording of Leo playing a Bach partita. I found the comic book a week later in the recycling bin, stained with coffee grounds. The pain crested as the bus hurtled through the Bronx, the city lights beginning to smear the horizon. It wasn't the drowned hard drive that was the source of the agony. It wasn't even the life insurance policy. It was the spreadsheet, the family contribution plan, the clinical, passionless document that had stripped me of my humanity and recast me as a financial instrument, a low-risk asset, a utility, the memory of my pneumonia, the hushed voices prioritizing Leo's peace of mind over my health, now clicked into place with horrifying logic. Of course they weren't worried about me. You don't worry about an investment's feelings, you worry about its performance, its ability to yield returns. A silent scream built in my chest, a pressure so immense I thought my ribs would crack. I had to bite down on the inside of my cheek, the sharp, coppery taste of blood grounding me as tears I refused to shed burned the backs of my eyes. This was the peak, the absolute zenith of my pain. The crushing, suffocating realization that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had, in fact, never truly seen me at all. I was not their daughter. I was their commodity. The ghost in their house had a purpose after all, to one day become its financier. In that moment, huddled in a rattling bus seat, I felt a loneliness so vast and absolute it was like floating in the cold vacuum of space. The girl named Amelia Edwards died on that bus. She died, and from her ashes, something else was clawing its way into existence. By the time the bus hissed to a stop in the cavernous, grimy belly of the Port Authority bus terminal, the pain had been transmuted. Grief is a passive emotion. It is endured. What I felt now was active. It was rage, forged in the crucible of my pain and honed to a razor's edge. It demanded an outlet. It demanded a reckoning. Vengeance wasn't just a desire. It was a biological imperative, the only thing that could cauterize the wound. New York City was an assault on the senses, a cacophony that, instead of overwhelming me, felt like a baptism. The shriek of sirens, the roar of the subway beneath my feet, the 1,000 different languages spoken at once, it was the opposite of the curated, oppressive silence of my home. It was chaos. It was freedom. I walked out into the humid night air of 8th Avenue, just another anonymous face in a city of millions, and for the first time, I felt powerful. I was untethered, unseen, and utterly in control. My first 2 days were a blur of calculated moves. I used the cash to rent a small, windowless room in a hostel in the East Village, paying week by week. No questions, no credit card, no paper trail. I bought a burner phone from a corner store, a cheap flip phone that was a technological fossil, but more importantly, it was a ghost. My old life, my old number, my social media, I let it all die. I was offline, off-grid. I was a blank slate. The name came to me on the 3rd day, as I stood on the Williamsburg Bridge, watching the subway cars rattle past. I was an echo. The unheard reverberation of a sound, the lingering presence of a voice that had been silenced. It was perfect. Amelia was the sacrifice. Echo would be the retribution. With my new identity hardening in my mind, the first phase of my plan began to take shape. My father's greatest asset was Leo's talent, but his greatest vulnerability was his own public image. He and my mother had meticulously crafted a persona in their small, affluent community, the dedicated, self-sacrificing parents of a musical genius. They were pillars of the local art scene, respected members of the conservatory's board of patrons. I would not attack Leo. He was a pawn, a gilded instrument in my father's symphony of ambition. I would attack the foundation of their world, their reputation. I found a 24-hour print shop in K-Town, the kind with a row of aging computers for rent by the hour. The air hummed with the sound of servers and smelled of toner and stale coffee. I sat down, paid for an hour in cash, and began to type. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a precision I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't writing with emotion. I was transcribing a verdict. The letter was a masterpiece of anonymous surgical cruelty. I didn't make accusations. I simply stated facts, quoting directly from the family contribution plan I had found in my father's study. I wrote about the mandatory familial tithe, the projection of my low-risk, high-yield potential, and the plan to divert 30% of my future income into an indefinite support fund for my brother. I presented it not as a daughter's complaint, but as a concerned observer's discovery of a shocking and exploitative financial arrangement. I framed it as a story of a family so consumed by the ambition for one child that they had, in essence, indentured the other. I never used my name. I was simply the sister, the daughter, the asset. The final paragraph was the kill shot. I wrote that, while Mr. and Mrs. Edwards publicly championed the arts and the nurturing of young talent, their private ledger revealed a much darker, more calculated strategy, one that raised troubling questions about the true cost of their son's success. I printed 20 copies. Then came the tedious part, the research. From another public computer at the New York Public Library, I spent hours digging through the public records and social media of my old life. I built a target list, the head of the conservatory, the two wealthiest patrons on the board, whose donations my father was always courting, the music critic for the local paper who had written glowing reviews of Leo, my parents' closest friends, the two couples they vacationed with every year, and finally, the most viciously gossipy mother from Leo's circle of musician friends. I bought stamps and plain white envelopes. Back in the anonymity of my hostel room, I addressed each one in block letters, my left hand disguised in a clumsy scrawl. The act was methodical, almost meditative. With each envelope I sealed, I felt a piece of the crushing weight on my chest lift. The pain wasn't gone, but it was being repurposed, converted from a static burden into kinetic energy. It was fuel. The final step was the most satisfying. I found a public mailbox on a busy street corner in Soho. One by one, I dropped the letters into the slot. The sound of each envelope sliding into the darkness was a note in a new kind of sonata. It wasn't a sound of grief or loss. It was the sound of a carefully placed charge being set. With the last letter, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A sharp, exhilarating jolt of manic satisfaction. The pain was still there. A low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer my master. I had taken my 17 years of silent echoes and weaponized them. I had aimed them back at the source of the sound, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the cacophony was about to begin. I walked away from the mailbox, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. The ghost had just begun to howl. The days following the deployment of my letter bomb were a strange purgatory. I existed in a state of suspended animation, my entire being coiled in anticipation. The raw, open wound of my grief had begun to scar over, and beneath the tight, pulling tissue of this new emotional armor, a cold purpose was taking root. I wasn't just surviving in New York, I was hunting. My small hostel room became my war room. The city's chaotic energy, which had at first been a comforting blanket of anonymity, was now a resource to be exploited. I was a ghost in the machine, and the first tremors of my haunting were about to be felt hundreds of miles away. My intelligence gathering began with the creation of a ghost of my own. At a public library in Midtown, surrounded by the quiet rustle of pages and the hum of fluorescent lights, I birthed a new identity. Her name was Brenda Sullivan. She was a 40-something mother, a recent transplant to the Boston suburbs from out of state. Her fictional son was a budding cellist, and she was eager to connect with the local arts community. I created a Facebook profile for her, using a stock photo of a pleasant, vaguely familiar-looking woman. I populated her feed with generic posts, enthusiasm for the Boston Symphony, questions about the best local music tutors, and praise for the conservatory my father held in such high esteem. With Brenda as my digital key, I gained access. I joined the Westwood Conservatory Patrons Group, the Boston Classical Music Parents Alliance, and a half-dozen other online forums where the affluent, arts-loving suburbanites of my old world congregated. For the first week, I was a silent observer, a digital anthropologist studying the tribe that had cast me out. I learned their language, their anxieties, their petty rivalries, and then, the first ripples appeared. It started subtly. A post from the conservatory's fundraising chair announced that the annual Patrons Gala, a major event my father always co-chaired, was being postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. The comments section was a flurry of polite confusion. Then, a more direct hit. A woman in one of the parent groups posted a vague, leading question, asking if anyone else had heard unsettling rumors about the fundraising practices of certain prominent families. The post was deleted within an hour, but not before I had screenshotted it. The letters had landed. The poison was seeping into the soil. This was my cue to escalate. The letters were a chemical agent. Now I needed a catalyst to make them combust. My target was Arthur Finch, the music critic for the Boston Globe. His name had been on my list, a man whose fawning prose had helped build the myth of Leo Edwards. He was ambitious, I knew from his writing, always looking for a story that would elevate him beyond local concert reviews. I would give him that story. From a new, encrypted email account created at another library, I sent my first message. The subject line was simple: the price of a prodigy. In the body, I was concise and professional. I identified myself only as a source with intimate knowledge of the Edwards family's internal finances. I attached a single redacted image, a screenshot of the mandatory familial tithe line from my father's spreadsheet, with the monetary values blurred but the damning title perfectly clear. I ended the email with a single sentence, telling him that this document was part of a much larger, meticulously planned financial structure, and I had the rest. The bait was too tempting for him to ignore. He replied within an hour, his professional skepticism barely concealing a ravenous curiosity. He asked for proof of my identity, for more context, for a phone call. I denied him all of it. My intelligence was in controlling the flow of information. I told him my anonymity was non-negotiable, a matter of personal safety. I explained that I would provide verifiable information in pieces, and he could use his journalistic skills to corroborate it. This wasn't just for my protection. It was a calculated move to make him feel like he was uncovering the story himself, investing his own effort and ego into it. Over the next 3 days, we engaged in a tense, digital dance. I became a master storyteller, weaving a narrative of systemic emotional and financial exploitation. I told him about the second-hand bicycle and the gleaming Trek racer, framing it not as a child's complaint but as an early example of a disparate resource allocation strategy. I described the incident with my pneumonia, carefully terming it the prioritization of one child's professional comfort over the other's medical needs. I even told him about the art portfolio, describing how my father had actively sabotaged my pursuit of a scholarship to a prestigious arts institution to eliminate any potential drain on family resources. Each piece of information was a carefully placed brick in the wall of my father's damnation. I never used emotional language. I was a whistleblower, not a victim, presenting a cold, factual case study. With each email I sent, I felt a piece of my past being repurposed. The memories, once sources of agonizing pain, were now weapons. The comic book in the trash, the ignored art award, every casual dismissal, they were no longer just wounds. They were evidence. They were ammunition. The feeling was intoxicating, a far more potent balm than tears could ever be. The chronic ache in my chest was being replaced by the sharp, focused thrill of the hunt. The article was published on a Tuesday morning. I saw it on my burner phone, sitting on a bench in Washington Square Park. The headline was larger than I could have hoped for. A prodigy's price. Insiders allege financial exploitation in family of acclaimed pianist Leo Edwards. My hands were perfectly steady as I read it. Finch had done his job. He had taken my leaks and woven them into a devastating narrative. He quoted anonymous sources from the conservatory patrons who had clearly received my letter and were now confirming the disquiet in the community. He had even managed to get a quote from my father, who had furiously denied the slanderous and absurd allegations, a denial so filled with blustering rage that it read as a confession. The article didn't just report on the spreadsheet. It painted a portrait of a family operating like a ruthless corporation, with a CEO father, a star product son, and a hidden, devalued asset daughter. I read the article 3 times. There was no joy, no triumphant laughter. There was only a profound, quiet, and deeply satisfying sense of order being restored to the universe. The pain that had been a raging inferno inside me was now banked to a low, steady pilot light, its heat channeled outward. For 17 years, my story had been silenced. Now, it was on the front page of the arts section, for the entire world to see. But I wasn't done. The article was a public shaming. Now, I needed to hit them where they lived, their finances. The two wealthiest patrons on the conservatory board, a tech mogul and an old money heiress, were the pillars holding up my father's social standing. The article had made them nervous. I needed to make them terrified. From the same anonymous email, I sent one final message, BCC'd to both of them. The subject: regarding the Globe article. The message was short and brutal. I told them that the journalist had only scratched the surface. I informed them that I was in possession of other documents, including a certain life insurance policy that designated a child's potential death payout as a source of funding for the other child's education. I then delivered the final, decisive blow. I wrote that any public figure who continued to be associated with Edward Edwards' unique financial and familial strategies might soon find their own philanthropic records subject to the same level of intense, unwelcome scrutiny. It wasn't blackmail. It was a calculated risk assessment, delivered in the language they understood best. I was showing them that standing by my father was no longer a tenable position. He was not just a friend, he was a liability. I hit send and shut down the computer. I walked out of the library and into the brilliant New York sunshine. I didn't know what would happen next. Not exactly. But I knew I had done more than just run away. I had taken the architecture of my own oppression, the meticulous plans my father had laid out for my life, and I had used them to draw up the blueprints for his ruin. The echo had become a roar, and the foundations of the House of Edwards were beginning to crumble. The aftermath was not a storm. It was a vacuum. It was the sudden, deadening silence that follows a massive explosion. When the air has been sucked out of the world and all that remains is a ringing in your ears. My world, however, was filled with the vibrant noise of New York. The silence was theirs, and I observed it from a distance, a cold and clinical god watching her creation unravel. My window into their collapse was an unlikely one. Brenda Sullivan's newest, most eager Facebook friend, a woman named Carol. She was the gossipy mother I had targeted with a letter, and she had taken to my fictional persona like a moth to a flame. Believing she was confiding in a fellow arts-obsessed mother, Carol became an unwitting, unfiltered stream of intelligence, her messages a real-time chronicle of my family's implosion. She saw it as trading scandalous secrets. I saw it as receiving battlefield reports. The first report came 2 days after the Globe article. It was the conservatory board meeting. According to Carol, whose husband was a junior member, the atmosphere was funereal. The two major patrons, the tech mogul and the heiress, had formally withdrawn their support that morning, citing the need to reevaluate their philanthropic commitments in light of recent, troubling revelations. Their statement, delivered via their lawyers, was a public execution. My father, Carol wrote, had arrived looking haggard but defiant, ready to fight. He had attempted to deliver a speech, his voice booming with practiced indignation, calling the article a baseless attack from a disgruntled source, a work of fiction. But no one was listening. The room was a sea of cold shoulders and averted eyes. His allies, the people he had schmoozed and flattered for years, stared at their hands or at the ceiling. He was no longer a respected peer, he was a contagion. The chairman, a man who had shared brandy with my father for a decade, had cut him off mid-sentence. He had quietly informed my father that the board had voted unanimously to request his immediate resignation from all his positions, including his co-chairmanship of the now-cancelled gala. This was the moment Carol described with breathless detail. My father had become utterly speechless. His mouth had opened and closed, but no sound emerged. The booming voice that had dictated the terms of my existence, that had pronounced my future worthless, had failed him. His face, she reported, had turned a mottled, unhealthy shade of red, and he had simply stood there, mute and shaking, as the chairman collected his papers and adjourned the meeting. He had been rendered an echo in the room he once commanded. Reading Carol's excited messages, I felt nothing but a cold, clean satisfaction. I had taken his voice. It was a fair trade. The public humiliation was only the beginning. The shockwaves rolled outward, breaching the carefully manicured walls of our home. Carol, whose daughter took piano lessons from the same teacher as Leo, provided the next piece of the puzzle. The lessons had stopped. The teacher had called Carol in a fluster, telling her that Mrs. Edwards had canceled all of Leo's upcoming sessions indefinitely, offering no explanation. The great artist's rigorous training schedule, the one our entire family life had been structured around, had ground to a halt. Carol's gossip painted a picture of the house on Hemlock Lane as a mausoleum. My mother, once the tireless, energetic manager of Leo's career, was now, according to a neighbor Carol had spoken to, a ghost in her own home. She had been seen wandering in her garden at odd hours, aimlessly pulling at weeds that weren't there. She had stopped answering the phone. The constant stream of visitors, tutors, patrons, fellow musicians had ceased. My mother, whose entire identity was a reflection of her husband's ambition and her son's talent, had lost her sons. She was now just a pale, solitary moon, orbiting a dead star in a silent sky. I imagined her in that silent house, the oppressive weight of the grand piano a constant reminder of the future they had gambled on and lost. Her shock wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, creeping paralysis. But it was the news about Leo that landed with a strange, unexpected weight. Carol's daughter had seen him at school. He had lost weight, she said. He walked the halls with his head down, his golden boy aura completely extinguished. The story that was circulating, whispered in the corridors and practice rooms, was that he had had a breakdown. He had been in the conservatory's main recital hall, supposedly practicing for a competition that no longer mattered, and another student had heard a discordant crash. Peeking in, the student had seen Leo standing over the piano, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't touch the keys. He wasn't playing. He wasn't even trying. He was just staring at his own trembling hands as if they belonged to a stranger. He had then, according to the story, slowly lowered the keyboard lid, the soft thud of the felt on the ivory echoing in the vast, empty hall. He had not been back since. This piece of news didn't bring me the same clean satisfaction. It stirred something else. Something murkier. My entire life, I had seen Leo as the sun blinding, effortless, and impossibly distant. I never considered the pressure required to sustain such a light. My father's spreadsheet had cast me as the low-risk asset, but it had cast Leo as the high-risk one. His entire worth was tied to the performance of those two hands. And now, under the weight of scandal and failure, they had failed him. For the first time, I didn't see him as my rival. I saw him as the other column on the ledger, the other sacrifice. He was the bird in the gilded cage I had drawn, and my revenge hadn't set him free. It had simply shattered the cage, leaving him flightless and terrified in the wreckage. I thought of my father, locked in his study. But now, I imagined him not as a deposed king plotting his return, but as a man staring at the ashes of the legacy he had built on my back. I thought of my mother, adrift in her perfect home, with no purpose left to manage. And I thought of Leo, staring at the hands that were supposed to build their salvation, now rendered useless by the very pressure designed to make them great. They were speechless, broken, and utterly lost. They were drowning in the silence they had cultivated. Sitting in my tiny, anonymous room, the glow of the phone illuminating my face, I realized a profound truth about revenge. I had expected a release, a final, triumphant exorcism of my pain. But there was no triumph. The searing agony was gone, yes. The humiliation, the feeling of worthlessness, all of it had been transferred to them, as intended. But the space it left behind was not filled with joy. It was just empty. It was a quiet, hollow space. I had meticulously engineered their downfall, and it had worked more perfectly than I could have imagined. I had silenced them. But their silence wasn't the victory I thought it would be. It was just an absence, a void. I closed my phone, cutting off the feed of Carol's vicarious drama. I picked up my old sketchbook, the one thing that had survived the purge. I flipped through the pages of old drawings, ghosts of a girl I barely recognized. My mission was complete. The House of Edwards was silent, and in that silence, for the first time, I could begin to hear my own voice. Revenge is a fire. It burns hot and bright, consuming everything in its path, the past, the pain, the people who hurt you. But a fire cannot burn forever. Eventually, it runs out of fuel, and all you are left with is the ash, the silence, and the cold, empty space where a world used to be. For months, I lived in that space. I had won. I had silenced the house on Hemlock Lane, shattered the dynasty of Edward Edwards, and broken the engine of my family's ambition. And yet, the victory was as hollow as a drum. The pain was gone, but peace had not taken its place. I had abandoned the name Echo along with the rage that created her. Echo was an instrument of war, and the war was over. I was just Amelia again, but an Amelia untethered from the ghost she used to be. I had moved out of the hostel and into a small third-floor walk-up in Bushwick, a room of my own bought and paid for with the severance I had claimed. I found a job waiting tables at a small diner, the anonymity of the work a comfort. And in my spare time, I began to create again, not with the frantic, desperate energy of before, but with a quiet, tentative hand. I was learning to draw without the shadow of my father's disapproval looming over my shoulder. The contact came on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was sorting through an old email account I hadn't touched since I'd left Boston, about to delete it for good, when I saw a name in the inbox that made my blood run cold. Leo Edwards. My first instinct was primal. It was the old rage, a dormant serpent stirring in my gut. I nearly deleted it without reading. Was it a plea for money? A demand for an explanation? A trap? But curiosity, a colder and more patient instinct, won out. I clicked it open. The email was short. It was not a plea or a demand. It was a confession. He told me he knew I was the one who had sent the letters, who had spoken to the journalist. He wasn't angry. He told me he had found the family contribution plan and the insurance policy on my desk the day after I left. He said that reading those documents was like being woken up from a 17-year-long sleepwalk. He wrote that he understood now, and that he was sorry, not just for his part in it, but for his silence, his complicity. He ended by telling me that he was no longer playing the piano, and that if I was ever willing, he just wanted to talk. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was asking for a witness. For 2 days, I did nothing. I reread the email until the words blurred. The apology I had once craved felt like a foreign currency for which I had no use, but the line that haunted me was the last one. He was no longer playing the piano. The altar at the center of our family had been abandoned. The star had extinguished its own light. Something compelled me to agree. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about archaeology. I needed to understand the shape of the ruins I had created. We met at a small, windswept park overlooking the East River. It was a neutral ground, a place that belonged to neither of us. He was already there, sitting on a bench, and I almost didn't recognize him. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a thin, pale young man who looked startlingly ordinary. The arrogant grace was replaced by a deep, weary stillness. His hands, the hands that had been insured and protected and worshipped, were shoved into the pockets of his jacket as if he were hiding them. We didn't embrace. We barely made eye contact. I sat at the other end of the bench. For a long time, we just watched the river, the silence between us heavy with the ghosts of everything unsaid. He was the one who finally spoke, his voice quiet, stripped of its former confidence. He told me about the aftermath. He described our father's hollowed-out rage, a man who had lost his entire sense of self. He spoke of our mother's complete breakdown, a woman who would wander the silent house, sometimes stopping to dust the keys of the grand piano before drifting away again. He told me that for his entire life, our father had fed him a narrative, a story where Leo was a fragile celestial talent, and I was the strong, practical, sensible one. It wasn't that I was less loved, our father had explained to him, but that I was built for the real world, while he was built for the stage. My purpose in this story was to be his anchor, his support. It was a lie, he said, but it was a beautiful, seductive lie, and he had believed it because he needed to. The most chilling truth came when he talked about the piano. He confessed that for the last few years, he had started to hate it. The pressure had become a physical weight, giving him migraines and anxiety attacks. But he couldn't stop, because his talent wasn't his own. It belonged to our father. It was the family's single, most valuable asset. My escape, my act of rebellion, had shown him that an exit was possible. He told me that seeing those documents, he finally understood the truth. Our father didn't love him more than me. Our father loved the idea of him. He loved the ambition that Leo represented. We were never his children. We were his investments. One was a blue-chip stock, destined for greatness. The other was a municipal bond, safe and reliable. meant to hedge the risk of the first. The discovery didn't make him hate our father, he said. It made him pity him. Listening to him, the last vestiges of my rage dissolved, not into forgiveness, but into a profound, desolate clarity. The betrayal was not that my parents loved my brother more. The true betrayal was that they had never truly loved either of us for who we were. They loved us for what we could do for our father's ego, for his failed dreams. Leo was the chosen one, yes, but a chosen sacrifice is still a sacrifice. I finally looked at him. Really looked at him. I saw the cage I had always drawn. I saw the trapped songbird. And I realized the most valuable lesson of my entire ordeal. Revenge is a blunt instrument. It had punished the guilty, but it hadn't healed the wound. It had focused on settling the score with my family. But the true path to freedom wasn't about destroying them. It was about understanding that I was never playing their game to begin with. I told him I was sorry, not for what I did, but for what had been done to both of us. I told him that I was glad he had stopped playing. He looked at his hands, pulling them from his pockets for the first time. He said he was thinking of studying architecture. He wanted to build things, he said, not just perform them. We left the park without a promise to see each other again. There was no tearful reunion, no grand absolution. There was only the quiet, mutual acknowledgement of a shared trauma and the separate paths we now had to walk. That night, back in my apartment, I started a new piece on my tablet. It wasn't a work of anger or sorrow. It was a drawing of a shattered porcelain bowl, but instead of lying in pieces, its cracks were being filled with veins of molten gold, sealing it back together, making it stronger and more beautiful than it was before. I had learned the Japanese term for it in an art history book, kintsugi. The art of repairing what is broken and treating the damage as part of an object's history. I had spent so long defining myself by my scars, by the cracks in my foundation. First, as a victim, then, as an avenger. But sitting there, in the quiet of my own life, I realized I was neither. I was the artist. And the story was not about the breaking, it was about what you choose to build from the pieces. My revenge had given me my freedom, but it was this quiet, painful truth that was finally teaching me what to do with it.